Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to this workshop. I'm excited here to announce Sadia, who will be coming on shortly. To set it up and to prime it, I really want to talk about the differences that we're starting to see in the 21st century today. And it's probably one of the most exciting times that you're sitting in the world today of where we look at from a diversity and inclusion. At LinkedIn alone, we went on a tour for 9 months, and we really tried to understand how is diversity showing up for our workforce, and how's it showing up around the world for our members.
Fine,
and what we
you.
saw was that today there's over 20 dimensions of diversity. So we're really looking at a complex problem, and yet we've been at it for decades and really haven't made a difference on gender diversity. So you're going to hear a little bit today about what Sadia is doing around that, and policies and programs and best practices that different workforces are bringing today, and hopefully you'll get some insights away from that. Another thing that I want to talk about is our vision. And this is something that really drew me to come to LinkedIn, and the work that we're doing is creating that economic opportunity for all professionals. And yet we know today, looking at the LinkedIn profile, that women aren't as represented as they should be. If you look at the job descriptions or how people set themselves, men have more words that they're putting in than women. And yet they won't put pictures or their skill sets within that. So how do we begin to change the trajectory? So as HR professionals and recruiters, that we can actually create that economic opportunity for everyone. So I'm happy to say that this is part of my vision, this is part of our vision. Collectively, we're going to make the change that we want to. But it really needs to start here and today. So I'm happy to say our speaker, Sadia Zahadi, is an economist who helps us to better understand why closing the gender gap and bringing women into the economy is not just a good thing, but improves outcomes for everyone. She is a senior director at the World Economic Forum, which brings together stakeholders from across business, governments, and NGOs in collaborative efforts to improve the state of the world. As head of employment and gender initiatives and a member of the executive committee, Sadia brings a global view to advocate for women in the workforce. She has deep expertise in gender equality, diversity, jobs, and talent. She has founded cutting-edge reports at the forum that provides new ways to measure the gender gap. She leverages these insights to forge partnerships and encourages the spread of best practices that can lead to change, lasting change. Sadia was named one of BBC's 100 Women in 2013 and 14, and last year won the inaugural F.T. McKinsey Bracken Bauer Prize for authors under 35 for her book proposal, Women Economics in the Muslim World. I know you are looking forward to hearing her perspective on how we can all address cultural differences and other diversity in the workplace. Please join me in welcoming Saida.
Sorry. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me here. Thanks to LinkedIn for bringing me in. You know, when we talk about gender parity or gender diversity, there's so much negative. There's so much that needs to be changed. But we seem to be at the peak of a momentum. And let me tell you a little bit about that momentum, about how positive it is, and how we can sort of ride that wave towards equality, accelerate equality. One major change in the global context is what has happened in terms of education in the last 30 to 40 years. In most countries around the world, women are the majority of those that are coming out of universities. In fact, out of the 140 countries that we do research on, 100 of them have reversed the gender gap in terms of university education. At the same time, though, only about 4 countries have reversed that gender gap in terms of the labor force. So while the skilled labor that's coming out of universities is overwhelmingly female, things look very different when you get into the labor force. And out of the 62 countries which have actually managed to reverse the gender gap for all professional roles, only about 4 of them have reversed that gap when it comes to senior leadership. And all of this, of course, is becoming more and more critical as many societies start aging, as that creates pressures on fertility. In fact, many economies are in a fertility trap where they're both aging and not having more children. And at the same time, what that means is we're not getting the labor force that we need today, nor for the future. So there are talent gaps that need to be met. A second major trend is we know so much more about why it's important to close gender gaps. There's, of course, the equality and fairness argument, and a lot of people buy into that. But for those that need a little bit more convincing, there's also a business case. There's an economic case. So we know that economies that integrate more women into their labor force grow faster, they're competitive, they're more inclusive. In business, of course, we know there's a sort of a consumer case, right? If your consumers are overwhelmingly female, well, you should reflect that diversity internally. We know that teams that are more diverse take better decisions, are better able to manage risk. And we know that because that talent is so overwhelmingly female these days, they need to be integrated into teams and across the hierarchies of companies. But there's also evidence from the education field, from the health field. When women are more educated, that leads to better development, that leads to more sustainable development, that leads to lower fertility and better health. When women are more integrated into politics, economies grow faster and they grow more inclusively. And then there's a third aspect, which is the changing sort of norms and values around, in economist terms, the division of labor at home as compared to the division of labor at work. So while in most of the world, even men that are not working spend less time on primary childcare than women that are working, so that pattern kind of holds true across the world, and that's what you see in that table there. At the same time, the expectations of the next generation are changing. Only about 35% of today's employed millennial men seem to believe that men should be breadwinners and women should be caregivers. Now, one way to look at that is, God, there's still 35% of men who believe that men should be the breadwinners and women should be caregivers. The other way to look at it is that this is pretty much the reverse of how the situation used to be even 10 years ago. So, how long before we might close this economic gender gap? According to the World Economic Forum's research, the work we've been doing over the last 10 years or so on tracking gender equality, if we continue at the same pace of change, it could take another 81 years. Now, we think there are some really compelling reasons for why it shouldn't take 81 years and why we might see an acceleration. One, because there are already countries that have very successfully managed to make progress much faster. So countries like Korea that started out at having less than 60% gender equality are now at about 65% gender equality. Now, those statistics basically translate to thousands and thousands more women that are in education and that are participating in the labor force. The United Kingdom, where we are, is an interesting case because it actually was doing better 10 years ago than it does today. So reversal is also possible. But by and large, for about 85% of the economies around the world, this gap is getting closed faster than it was 10 years ago. So what might the future hold? This is all new data that hasn't really been released by the World Economic Forum yet, so you're getting a preview of it. We asked the heads of HR of over 500 major global companies in 20 emerging and developed markets across 10 different industries, and we asked them a number of questions about what the future of jobs might look like, what employment in their industry would look like, which occupations they're going to need more talent for, which occupations might be going redundant, and where do they currently employ women, and where will they be employing more women, and where do they find it hardest to recruit women. So what you're seeing here, the blue is showing you where they find it today harder to recruit women in critical roles, and in the gray, where they expect it to be even harder to recruit women as compared to men in 2020. So we're just talking about a period of 5 years. And what you'll see is, these are 4 very different industries. In most of these industries, it is harder to recruit women for critical roles, and it is harder to, it's expected to be even harder by 2020. Now, this is in some cases, in areas in ICT, for example, in computer and mathematical functions, perhaps not a surprise, because we know that women are going less into STEM professions as compared to men. But that pattern is holding true for most professions, for other areas as well, which have traditionally had many more women going into those fields of education. And one clue as to why this might be happening is when we ask them about the strategies they're using. So most of them were able to come up with great reasons for why this was a problem, unconscious biases and what was happening in terms of recruitment, and there wasn't enough of a talent pool. But then when we asked them what strategies they're using, in the aviation, travel, and tourism industry, 15% of the companies had no strategy. In financial services, 35% had no strategies. And so we're talking about massive, global multinational firms, and these were some of the results. The other clue is in how much leadership is taking this issue seriously as a core talent issue. So 8% of the companies in the aviation, travel, and tourism space had leadership commitment on this issue. 9% in financial services, 10% in consumer and retail, and 8% again in ICT. So, and we all know that without that tone from the top, it's very hard to change this stuff. So what can we do today? And the World Economic Forum's efforts are focused around 3 particular areas. One, we're helping companies figure out what they could be doing and how they can take a holistic, proactive approach to this issue. So not just what happens in terms of leadership commitment, but what kind of targets they can set, what kind of gender-neutral policies they can have in terms of awareness raising, what kind of recruitment policies they can have, how the work environment can be changed, not just to benefit women, but actually to benefit all employees. And then what they can do amongst their suppliers and distributors, and finally, what kind of external public influence they can have on gender equality issues. And what we found is by collecting best practices from hundreds of companies that are World Economic Forum members, is that it really takes that holistic approach to make things work rather than 1 or 2 programs. A second area where the forum is working is actually try to get industries to work together. So that's a sample of what things look like in the oil and gas industry. So you've got women that are going into STEM education, yes, in lower numbers than men, but then when it comes to actually being able to recruit petrotechnical professionals in the oil and gas industry, there's an even bigger drop-off, even though women are getting those degrees. And then obviously that drop-off continues throughout. So there's a pipeline problem, there's a perception problem around the industry as being very male-dominated, and then there's sort of a playing field problem when it comes to the women that do make it inside the industry. And so certainly companies could tackle this issue on their own. They could try to deal with this on their own. They could create scholarships on their own for high schools and universities and get those women into the pipeline. They could try to change the perception on their own. But because the industry is facing this issue collectively, what we're working on doing is getting that industry to work together, find a sort of a multi-company, multi-stakeholder solution to that issue. And then a third aspect is, of course, public-private solutions. So all of this, regardless of which company it is and how they set their global diversity policy, all of this looks very different by country. It looks very different according to the enabling environment that is set by a government. It looks totally different in a country that has equal paternity leave and maternity leave, and very different in a country that has neither of those 2 things. So the World Economic Forum has been ranking countries for the last 10 years according to how well they're closing the gender gap. Not surprisingly, countries like Iceland and Sweden come out near the top. Countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia come out near the bottom. And this is despite us using an index that actually disconnects from the level of development or income. We're looking purely at the gap measure. So whether it's a rich country or a poor country, how equally is it dividing its resources and opportunities between women and men? And so these environments are incredibly different depending on where we are, and so companies are having to deal with those very different environments in those different areas. So one of the experiments that we have tried to do is in Mexico, Japan, Korea, and Turkey. This is where those governments have recognized that they will not be able to deal with their long-term talent gaps. They will not be able to have the kind of growth they're aspiring to have unless they actually integrate many more women into the economy. And so in each of those countries, what we've tried to do is bring together the relevant ministry, along with about 50 to 100 of the top businesses in that country, and got them to collectively set a target. And we started this in 2012, and they set a target for about 3 years' time to try to close the economic gender gap by 10% relative to their starting point. Now, 10% sounds very small, but that's often thousands and millions of people whose lives will be affected. And we are, in 3 years into the experiment, Turkey has closed 9.5% of that gap. Mexico has closed 2.5% of that gap. Japan has closed 7.5% of that gap. And Korea actually just started last year, so we're still assessing progress. So this kind of change is possible when the public sector is actually working collectively with the private sector, and that has been another successful way of trying to close gender gaps. Thank you.
12:30? Thank you for that. That was riveting. Why don't you join, and we'll open it up for the crowd very quickly if they have any questions. But for now, you talked a lot about a holistic approach and how approach can do. And I think that's an approach as well that LinkedIn and some other companies out there. Can I just show a hands of how many of you guys actually have a strategy in place with regards to diversity and inclusion? Yeah, it's hard to tell, but most of you guys have, which is very encouraging to see. In that, can you give us some ideas of best practices that companies have come together and what they've done to really kind of disrupt this, this environment?
So I think, a lot of companies are doing stuff individually. A lot of companies are working on, ways to, through their suppliers and through their distributors, integrate more women, put in place sort of almost a quota or a target for their suppliers and distributors. And when massive companies like Coca-Cola take on an initiative like that, their 5x20 initiative that is basically planning to empower 5 million women by the year 2020, that has a huge impact. And so there's definitely these very big, outstanding examples of the kind of effort that can be made. But there are also quieter experiments. There are also experiments with setting targets within companies. These are not companies whose names I could mention, but they're companies that have basically set in place very clearly targets that around women, women's participation in senior leadership. They've put in place mentorship programs that are not junior women or high potential women to senior women, that are really trying to have male executives and female executives interact with those high potential women. So there are a number of these experiments as well. But what I found to be most exciting is where companies are actually working together, where they're actually working together across industry lines and actually treating this as a high enough priority that, yes, talent is a competitive space, but it's going to be better for all of us if we collaborate.
And have you seen that mostly come across the world or in certain countries, or where companies are coming together?
So there are a lot of experiments happening these days, and I think some of it is happening. For example, a number of the firms that are based out in Silicon Valley have recently been talking a lot about gender diversity. That isn't necessarily a collective effort, but because the industry is being scrutinized to a certain extent in terms of what's happening on gender equality, they've put a lot of efforts in place. And in fact, the experiment that I talked about with the oil and gas industry, part of its rationale is, let's not wait until we're being called out for this. Let's actually proactively address this issue. And it's a global initiative, so it's around the world.
Right. And then one last question, then we'll open it up. I think there's mics on each side, so if you have a question, you can line up behind the mic and we can take it. One of the things at LinkedIn that we've taken on is really kind of reverse the thinking, in which let's lead with inclusion, because if we can create the environment, as you said, of where everyone can have a sense of belonging and feel like they can be part of that organization, that diversity will come through it. And we know in some cases, women just don't necessarily see the role models or the environments in order to welcoming in order to create that diversity. And I think you had talked to that in the beginning around the business case and how we can bring more women, particularly in the technical talent.
Yeah.
And then where we could find that talent or those new sources of talent. Have you seen anything or where companies are starting to push the edges on that?
So I would again point to that kind of collective industry approach. There are some industries where companies just simply do not have enough senior executives that are female, and so often those women are finding themselves over-solicited for providing mentoring, for providing guidance, for speaking on panels. And so again, there's a possibility of taking a more collective approach where you start having a pool of senior women from across different companies for that industry who then collectively try to provide that mentorship or that guidance, provide that role model effect.
That's a great call. And I think within the, and you bring it up, within the tech sector alone, we are doing more of that because I think the opportunity of what we can do, not only in how we can look to bringing women up the leadership, but how we start to pipeline the women of the future. So coming together at causes and really starting very early on in the high schools and stuff. If we have questions that, anybody have questions in the audience that you would like to hear? Can you talk to us a little bit about, you started to talk a little bit about future trends and the research you guys are doing. We've used your research quite a bit in the gender gap and closing it. A bit discouraging that we have this 80-year gap to close, but any additional insights that you're seeing through your research in any countries we know, the Scandinavian or other countries within this region?
Yeah. So interestingly, it's the countries that, again, this is not surprising, these are countries that are starting from such a low base that the relative change can be very high. But the country that in the last 10 years has made the most progress on closing the economic gender gap is Saudi Arabia. You know, it's not something that one would expect, but when you look at the data, that is where the biggest relative change is happening. Now, one way to interpret that is they're starting out so low that, of course, that relative change will be very big, but that is also because of a lot of very proactive efforts on the part of the Ministry of Labor, on the part of the local companies, and most of all on the part of the multinational companies that are based there, that are making this part of their sort of sustainability and responsibility agenda.
And then on the flip side, you had talked about the UK where it was losing ground. Is there something that has actually created that dynamic?
It's just sort of flatlined in terms of women's participation in the labor force, the wage gap, and women's participation in senior leadership positions. And that's been the case for the last 5 years or so. It's just basically remained steady. And that doesn't mean that it's going down. It just simply means that it's remained flat while other countries are moving forward. And so it's been losing positions steadily in the last 10 years that we've been measuring these gaps.